In the quiet spaces between what we know and what we wonder about, there exist stories that have shaped the very foundations of faith itself. Tonight, we journey into one of the most profound struggles in biblical history. A struggle not of sword against sword, but of heart against heart, of devotion against desire. The world of ancient Israel was not the pristine, monotheistic landscape we might imagine from our modern perspective. It was a world alive with competing voices, filled with the scent of burning incense, the gleam of golden images, and the whispered promises of gods who seemed more immediate, more tangible than the invisible God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the story of idolatry, not merely as ancient history, but as a window into the human condition itself. Behind every carved image and sacred grove lay deeper questions. What do we truly worship? Where do we place our ultimate trust? And why is the human heart so easily drawn toward the visible, the immediate, the seemingly controllable? So, before we begin our journey through these sacred and troubling landscapes, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these explorations of faith and history. And let me know in the comments what story resonates with you. It's always wonderful to see how these ancient struggles still speak to us today. Now, let's find a quiet space and step back into a world where the line between the sacred and the profane was both everything and nothing at all. Verse 1. Daily life immersion. An artisan in a pagan temple. The morning sun filters through the doorway of the workshop, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Your hands, already stained with the residue of countless days, reach for the bronze tools that have become extensions of your very being. You are an artisan in the temple of Baal Peor, and today, like every day for the past 7 years, you will breathe life into metal and stone. The smell of the forge mingles with something else, the sweet, cloying scent of frankincense that never quite leaves this place. Your workshop sits in the shadow of the great temple, close enough that you can hear the morning prayers of the priests, their voices rising and falling in ancient rhythms that your grandfather's grandfather would have recognized. You lift a piece of bronze, still warm from yesterday's work. It will become part of a ritual vessel, something beautiful and terrible in its purpose. As your hammer finds its rhythm against the metal, you cannot help but think of the stories your Hebrew neighbors tell, stories of a God who forbids such work, who calls it abomination. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the tools of your trade and the expectations of your community, such thoughts seem distant and abstract. The bronze is real. The fire is real. The coins that the temple priests place in your palm each week are real. You pause in your work and look around the workshop. In various stages of completion, your creations wait. A small household god for a merchant's family, its face bearing the serene expression you've learned to carve by heart. A larger piece commissioned for the temple itself, its arms outstretched in eternal blessing. And in the corner, covered by a cloth, something you've been working on in the quiet hours after the official work is done. The covered piece troubles you, though you cannot say exactly why. It's a figure of Asherah, the mother goddess, her form both beautiful and imposing. But as you've shaped her features day by day, you found yourself thinking not of divine power, but of your own mother, who died when you were still young. You've given this bronze goddess your mother's eyes, and sometimes, in the flickering light of the oil lamps, it seems as though she might speak. A priest enters your workshop, his robes rustling softly against the stone. He is young, younger than you, but he carries himself with the authority of one who speaks directly to the gods. His eyes survey your work with the practiced gaze of someone who understands both artistry and theology. The festival of the new moon approaches, he says, his voice carrying the particular cadence of those who spend their days in prayer. The community will bring their offerings, and they will want to see the divine presence made manifest. Your work helps bridge the gap between the seen and the unseen. You nod, understanding your role in this sacred theater. Your hands create the focal points for devotion, the tangible representations of powers that remain otherwise beyond human reach. In a world where the divine often seems distant and silent, your bronze and stone gods offer immediate comfort. They can be touched, adorned, carried, consulted. As the priest examines the household god you've been crafting, you watch his face for approval. His opinion matters not just for your livelihood, but for your standing in the community. To be the temple's artisan is to hold a position of honor, to be trusted with sacred work. The expression is perfect, he murmurs, running his finger along the smooth bronze cheek. Benevolent, but strong. The family who commissioned this will feel their God's presence every time they look upon it. After he leaves, you return to your hammer and bronze, but your mind wanders to the Hebrew settlement on the other side of the valley. You've heard their elders speak of their God invisible, demanding, jealous. They say he needs no image, because he is beyond all human representation. You've heard them call your work dead idols, empty shells that cannot see or hear or act. But as you work, you feel the life that flows through your hands into the metal. Not literal life, perhaps, but something more subtle, the accumulated prayers and hopes of all who will touch these pieces, the comfort they will provide to families in times of trouble, the sense of divine presence they will bring to otherwise ordinary homes. The afternoon brings a different rhythm to your work. The bronze has cooled enough for detail work, and you begin the delicate process of engraving protective symbols along the base of the ritual vessel. Each mark has meaning, passed down through generations of artisans. Some protect against evil spirits, others ensure good harvests. Still others guarantee the favor of the gods in matters of love and war. As your engraving tool moves across the bronze surface, you think about the Hebrew stories again. They speak of their God creating humans in his own image, rather than humans creating gods in their image. The concept seems backward to you. Surely the divine must be made comprehensible to human minds, must be given forms that human hearts can embrace. Yet there are moments, especially in the deep quiet of late afternoon, when the workshop grows dim and your tools grow heavy in your hands, when you wonder what it would be like to worship a God who needed nothing from you, who could not be contained or controlled, or even properly understood. A customer arrives as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon. She is a widow, her clothing simple but clean, her eyes carrying the particular sadness of recent loss. She has come to inquire about a small memorial piece, something to help her maintain connection with her deceased husband's spirit. As you discuss the commission, showing her examples of your work and explaining the symbols that might best serve her needs, you are struck by the raw humanity of the moment. Her grief is real, her need for comfort is real, and the bronze figure you will create for her will serve as a tangible anchor for her prayers and memories. This is the heart of your work. You realize not the grand theological statements or the impressive temple pieces, but these quiet moments of human need, meeting divine possibility. Your gods may be bronze and stone, but the emotions they channel and focus are as real as breath itself. The day draws to a close, and you begin the familiar ritual of banking your fires and cleaning your tools. Tomorrow will bring more bronze, more commissions, more opportunities to bridge the gap between human longing and divine presence. As you prepare to leave the workshop, you glance once more at the covered figure of Asherah in the corner. Tomorrow, you will add the final touches to her face, and then she will be ready for the temple's inner sanctum. But tonight, in the gathering darkness, she seems to watch you from beneath her cloth covering, her bronze eyes holding secrets you cannot quite fathom. You step out into the evening air, leaving behind the smell of metal and incense, and make your way home through streets filled with the soft sounds of families gathering for their evening meals. Above you, the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, and you cannot help but wonder which gods rule over those distant lights, and whether any of them care about the small bronze figures you craft in their honor. The night settles around you like a familiar cloak, and you carry with you the satisfaction of work well done. even as questions you cannot quite articulate continue to stir in the deeper places of your heart. Verse 2. Biography Event Narrative. Jeroboam and the Golden Calves. Let us step away from the intimate workshop and into the corridors of power, where decisions that seem practical in the moment can echo through generations like thunder in mountain valleys. The year is approximately 930 BCE, and the United Kingdom of Israel stands at a crossroads that will define the spiritual landscape of God's people for centuries to come. Jeroboam ben Nebat sits in his newly established capital at Shechem, the weight of an impossible crown heavy upon his brow. Just months ago, he was a regional administrator under King Solomon, talented but unremarkable in the vast machinery of the United Kingdom. Now, through a series of events that still seem to him like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, he finds himself ruler of 10 tribes, king of the northern kingdom of Israel. The prophet Ahijah's words still ring in his ears. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes. Divine mandate, the prophet had called it. God's judgment upon Solomon's idolatry and his foreign wives' influence. Jeroboam had been chosen, set apart, promised that his dynasty would endure if he walked in the ways of the Lord. But now, in the cold reality of governing, the practical challenges seem to overwhelm the spiritual promises. From his window, Jeroboam can see the road that leads south to Jerusalem. 3 times a year, during Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, this road fills with pilgrims from his own kingdom, traveling to worship at Solomon's temple. They carry with them their offerings, their silver, their gold, their loyalty, and perhaps most troubling of all, their hearts. His advisor, Abimelech, approaches with the morning's reports. The man's face carries the perpetual worry of one who must make impossible mathematics work 10 tribes to govern, an economy to establish, military threats from the south, where Rehoboam, Solomon's son, plots to reclaim the lost territory. The people continue to journey to Jerusalem for the festivals. Abimelech reports, his voice carefully neutral. The roads are filled with families making their way to the temple. Commerce suffers in their absence, and he pauses, choosing his words carefully. There are reports of men speaking longingly of reunification. Jeroboam closes his eyes. This is the heart of his dilemma, the problem that keeps him awake as the oil lamps burn low in the night hours. How can he build a kingdom when his people's hearts are anchored in another king's capital? How can he establish loyalty when the very center of their religious life draws them constantly southward? He has tried reasoning with the tribal leaders, explaining the political necessities, the economic advantages of independence. But when the festival seasons come, reason seems to evaporate like morning mist. The people pack their belongings and journey south, not as citizens of the northern kingdom, but as children of Israel, following traditions that stretch back to Moses himself. Abimelech, Jeroboam says quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, what if we could give them a reason to stay? The advisor's eyebrows rise slightly. My lord? Jeroboam turns from the window, his mind already racing ahead to possibilities that both thrill and terrify him. The journey to Jerusalem is long, costly, dangerous. Families must leave their fields, their flocks, their businesses. What if they could find the same presence, the same divine favor closer to home? The conversation that follows unfolds slowly, carefully, like men walking through a field they suspect might be filled with hidden pits. Neither speaks directly of what they are contemplating, but the implications hang in the air between them like incense smoke. Religious centers, northern alternatives to the Jerusalem temple, places where the people could offer their sacrifices, observe their festivals, encounter their God without the long journey south and the uncomfortable reminder that their religious center lies in the territory of their political rival. There are precedents, Abimelech suggests carefully. Dan has always been a place of spiritual significance, and Bethel Jacob himself saw the angels ascending and descending there. These are holy places in their own right. Jeroboam nods, but his mind has already moved beyond location to the more delicate question of form. How does one create a religious center that feels authentic, traditional, divinely blessed, while serving the very practical purpose of keeping citizens and their wealth within the kingdom's borders? The answer, when it comes to him, arrives with the strange inevitability of something that has been gestating in his thoughts for weeks without his conscious awareness. Golden calves? Not as objects of worship, he is careful to make this distinction in his own mind, but as representations, as divine thrones, as symbols of the same God who led Israel out of Egypt. After all, had not the people once before, in the wilderness at the foot of Mount Sinai, created a golden calf to represent the divine presence? Had not Aaron himself, Moses' own brother, fashioned the image? True, Moses had destroyed that calf in his anger, but perhaps Moses had misunderstood the people's intentions. Perhaps they had never meant to worship the calf itself, but only to create a visible symbol of the invisible God. The theological reasoning comes easily once he allows it to unfold. The God of Israel is too great to be contained in any single location. If he can dwell in the Jerusalem temple, surely he can also inhabit other places, other symbols. The golden calves would not replace God, but would serve as his earthly thrones, his visible presence among the northern tribes. Within months, the plan takes shape with a speed that surprises even Jeroboam himself. Master craftsmen are summoned from across the kingdom, their discretion purchased with gold, and their skills directed toward a project that will either establish the northern kingdom's religious independence or condemn it to spiritual disaster. The gold comes from temple treasuries, royal reserves, voluntary contributions from citizens, who are told they are participating in a great work of national establishment. The craftsmanship is exquisite. These will be no crude wilderness idols, but works of art worthy of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As the calves near completion, Jeroboam stands in the workshop where they are being finished, watching the final details being added to the gleaming surfaces. The similarity to the scene in our first segment is not lost on him here too, are artisans shaping metal into divine representation. Here too the mingled sense of forged fire and sacred purpose, but the scale is different. These are not household gods or temple decorations, but symbols meant to anchor the religious life of an entire kingdom. The responsibility weighs on him like stone. The craftsman working on the first calf looks up from his engraving tool. Majesty, what inscription would you have us place upon the base? Jeroboam considers the question. Words have power, particularly words carved in gold and placed in sacred spaces. What he says here will be repeated by priests and pilgrims for generations. These are your gods, O Israel, he says finally, the words coming from some deep place he hadn't known existed, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. It is the same phrase Aaron used in the wilderness, the same proclamation made at Sinai. By using these exact words, Jeroboam tells himself he is connecting his golden calves to that ancient precedent, legitimizing them through scriptural echo. But even as he speaks the words, some deeper part of his mind recoils from them. These are your gods, not this is where your God dwells, or these represent your God's presence, but these are your gods. The plural form troubles him, though he cannot quite articulate why. The dedication ceremonies are planned with meticulous care. At Dan and Bethel, elaborate festivals will mark the installation of the golden calves. Priests will be appointed not from the traditional Levitical lines, which remain loyal to Jerusalem, but from among the common people, men whose primary qualification is loyalty to the northern kingdom rather than ancient bloodlines. As the day of dedication approaches, Jeroboam finds himself caught between growing excitement and deepening unease. The practical benefits of the plan seem undeniable already. Citizens are speaking with enthusiasm about the new religious centers, about the convenience of worship closer to home, about the special blessing of having God's presence established in their own territory. But late at night, when the palace grows quiet and he is left alone with his thoughts, other voices whisper in the darkness. The words of the prophet Ahijah echo strangely now. If you will listen to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you, and will build you a sure house, as I built for David. Walking in God's ways, keeping his commandments, the commandments that speak so clearly about graven images, about not making likenesses of heavenly things, about worshiping God in the manner he has prescribed, rather than in the manner that seems politically expedient. On the morning of the dedication at Bethel, Jeroboam stands before the assembled crowd, resplendent in royal robes, the golden calf gleaming behind him in the morning sunlight. The people have come in great numbers, drawn by curiosity, by patriotic fervor, by genuine religious longing. He raises his hands, and the crowd falls silent. In this moment, he holds the spiritual future of the northern kingdom in his words. What he says here will echo through generations, will shape the faith and practice of countless families, will determine whether the northern tribes walk closer to God or further from him. Behold, he proclaims, his voice carrying across the gathered multitude, these are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. The crowd's response is immediate and enthusiastic. They have their own religious center now, their own divine presence, their own reason to remain in the north, rather than journey to Jerusalem. The political problem has been solved with elegant efficiency, but as the cheers rise around him and the first sacrifices are offered before the golden calf, Jeroboam feels something cold settle in his chest. The words he has spoken, the images he has created, the precedent he has established, they will outlive him, will spread through his kingdom like ripples from a stone cast into still water. In the years that follow, the golden calves become the defining feature of northern kingdom worship. Generations of kings will maintain them, expand their influence, build entire religious systems around them. The practical success is undeniable. The northern kingdom maintains its independence, its economy, its distinct identity. But the spiritual cost reveals itself slowly, like poison working through a body. The line between worshiping God through the golden calves and worshiping the calves themselves blurs with each passing generation. Other gods creep into the religious system, finding easy welcome in hearts already accustomed to visible representations of divine power. And in the quiet moments of his later years, when Jeroboam sits alone in his palace and contemplates the legacy he will leave, he sometimes wonders whether the road not taken, the harder path of maintaining loyalty to Jerusalem, of building political unity through spiritual unity, might have led to a different kind of kingdom altogether. But by then, the golden calves have become so woven into the fabric of northern worship that removing them would be like removing the foundation stones from beneath a building. The decision that seemed so reasonable, so necessary, so divinely justified in that moment of political crisis has become an irreversible current, carrying his people toward destinations he never intended to reach. The prophet Ahijah's warning echoes now with the terrible clarity of hindsight. But if you turn aside and forsake my statutes and my commandments that I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will pluck you up from my land that I have given you. In his final years, Jeroboam watches the road to Jerusalem and sees that it is no longer filled with pilgrims from the northern kingdom. His golden calves have succeeded in their purpose. But as he watches the empty road, he cannot shake the feeling that something precious has been lost, something that no amount of gold can ever replace. Verse 3, Mystery Culture Technology Deep Dive. High places and standing stones, idolatry across the land. Now let us step back from the political chambers and personal workshops, and climb the hills that dot the landscape of ancient Palestine. Here, on windswept heights and in sacred groves, we encounter a world of worship that predates Israel's arrival by centuries, yet continues to exert its influence long after the conquest. This is the world of the high places, the Bamit, and the standing stones that mark them. If you were to walk through the hill country of Judah or the mountains of Ephraim in the days of the divided kingdom, you would find that nearly every significant elevation bears the marks of sacred activity. These high places are not random locations, but carefully chosen sites where heaven and earth seem to touch, where the divine feels particularly accessible to human prayer and sacrifice. The morning mist still clings to the hillside as we approach one such site, perhaps 5 miles north of Jerusalem. The climb is not difficult, but it is deliberate. Each step up the worn stone path represents a movement away from the mundane world below and toward something transcendent. At the summit, a carefully arranged complex of stones awaits us. The central feature is immediately striking. A circle of standing stones, each roughly the height of a man, their surfaces weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain. These are the Massaboth, the standing stones that mark sacred space and serve as focal points for worship. Some bear carved symbols: the sun disk of Baal, the twisted serpent of fertility, the tree of life sacred to Asherah. Others remain blank, their significance known only to the local communities that maintain them. Within the stone circle stands an altar of unhewn stone, built according to ancient specifications that echo the commands given to Moses, yet adapted for purposes Moses never intended. The altar's surface bears the dark stains of countless sacrifices, not just animals, but grain offerings, wine libations, oil and incense, burned in hopes of divine favor. Around the central area, smaller installations serve specialized purposes. Here, a basin carved from local limestone catches rainwater, considered especially pure for ritual washing. There, a small cave entrance leads to an underground chamber where sacred objects are stored and oracular consultations take place. Sacred trees, usually terebinths or oaks, provide shade and serve as living symbols of divine presence, their branches often decorated with small offerings and votive objects. But perhaps most intriguing are the artifacts that speak to the complex religious syncretism of the period. Scattered among the obviously Canaanite symbols, we find objects that clearly derive from Israelite tradition: pottery sherds bearing Hebrew inscriptions, bronze vessels of distinctly Jewish design, even fragments of what appear to be copies of biblical texts. This is the puzzle that has challenged archaeologists and biblical scholars for generations. How do we understand the religious landscape of ancient Israel, where pure monotheism existed alongside practices that seem fundamentally incompatible with the worship of Yahweh alone? Recent archaeological discoveries have begun to illuminate this complex picture. At sites like Kuntalet Ajrad in the Sinai Desert and Khirbet el-Qom near Hebron, inscriptions have been found that reveal the startling extent to which syncretistic worship had penetrated even supposedly Orthodox Israelite communities. These texts speak casually of Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting that many Israelites saw no contradiction between worshiping the God of Israel and acknowledging a divine consort alongside him. The technology of these high places reveals sophisticated understanding of both engineering and psychology. The stone circles are positioned to capture and amplify sound, so that prayers and chants spoken within them carry with unusual clarity. The altars are designed with channels and basins that efficiently collect and direct the blood of sacrifices, creating dramatic visual effects that reinforce the worshipper's sense of divine presence. More subtly, the entire layout of a typical high place follows principles that we might now call environmental psychology. The approach path winds upward in a spiral, creating a sense of journey and transformation. The arrangement of stones and structures guides the eye toward focal points while creating intimate spaces for small group worship. Even the choice of building materials, usually local stone that harmonizes with the natural landscape, reinforces the sense that these are not artificial impositions upon the land, but organic expressions of its sacred character. The seasonal rhythms of high place worship reveal another layer of complexity. During the spring planting season, the focus shifts to fertility rituals designed to ensure good harvests. Clay figurines of pregnant women and nursing mothers appear among the offerings, along with ceramic models of grain and fruit. The summer solstice brings fire ceremonies, with special altars constructed for burning offerings to the sun god. Autumn harvest festivals involve elaborate feasting and the decoration of sacred trees with the first fruits of the season. Winter worship takes on a different character entirely. As the rains begin and the landscape turns green, the high places become sites for ritual purification and renewal. Worshippers climb the hills carrying water vessels, oils, and new clothing, seeking cleansing and spiritual rebirth. The archaeological record shows heavy concentrations of ritual bath installations dating to this period, suggesting that even Israelite communities had adopted the purification practices of their Canaanite neighbors. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of high place worship is the way it evolved in response to official religious reforms. When King Hezekiah attempted to centralize worship in Jerusalem and destroy the high places, the archaeological evidence suggests that many communities simply moved their sacred activities to less visible locations. Underground chambers became more elaborate. Hidden groves replaced open-air stone circles, and portable shrines allowed for quick concealment when royal inspectors approached. This adaptability points to something fundamental about the appeal of high place worship. Unlike the formal, centralized cult of the Jerusalem temple, the high places offered immediate access to divine power. A farmer whose crops were failing didn't need to undertake a costly journey to Jerusalem and wait for the proper festival season. He could climb the local hill, offer a simple sacrifice, and petition the gods directly for relief. The personal nature of much high place worship is revealed in the votive offerings archaeologists continue to discover. Tiny bronze figurines show individuals in poses of prayer or supplication. Ceramic plaques bear hastily scratched prayers for healing, fertility, protection from enemies. Clay tablets record vows made in desperate moments, promises to offer specific sacrifices if prayers are answered, covenants with local deities for ongoing protection. These personal artifacts paint a picture of religious life far removed from the grand theological statements of biblical prophets. Here we see ordinary people grappling with immediate concerns: sick children, failed crops, difficult pregnancies, family disputes, business ventures. The high places provided a religious technology that addressed these concerns directly and personally. The gender dynamics of high place worship also differ markedly from Jerusalem temple practice. While the official cult was dominated by male priests from specific tribal lineages, the high places welcomed female religious practitioners. Inscriptions mention priestesses, prophetesses, and female ritual specialists who played central roles in community worship. Clay figurines suggest that women found particular welcome in the fertility cults associated with Asherah worship. This inclusivity extended beyond gender to social class as well. While temple worship required expensive sacrificial animals and adherence to complex purity laws, the high places accepted whatever offerings worshippers could bring. Pottery fragments show evidence of meals shared among social classes that would never mix in more formal religious settings. The archaeology suggests communities of worship that cross traditional boundaries of wealth, status, and tribal affiliation. Yet the biblical texts consistently condemn these practices, and archaeological evidence reveals why. Over time, many high places became sites of practices that even syncretistic Israelites would have found troubling. Child sacrifice, documented at sites like the Tophet in Jerusalem, represented the extreme end of Moloch worship. Ritual prostitution, while perhaps not as widespread as once believed, clearly occurred at some locations. Divination practices involving communication with the dead violated fundamental Israelite beliefs about the nature of life and death. The physical remains of these practices create a sobering counterpoint to the more benign aspects of high place worship. Infant burial jars, found in large numbers at certain sites, bear witness to the terrible costs of seeking divine favor through child sacrifice. Ostraka containing curses and binding spells reveal the darker side of popular religion, where divine power could be manipulated for personal revenge and magical coercion. As we stand among these ancient stones, watching the sun set over the hills of Judah, we are confronted with the complexity of human religious experience. The high places were simultaneously sites of genuine spiritual seeking and locations of practices that violated the most basic moral intuitions. They offered immediate access to divine power, but at costs that ultimately proved unsustainable. The archaeological record suggests that by the late monarchy period, many Israelite communities were attempting to navigate between official condemnation and popular practice. Modified high places appear, stripped of their most obviously pagan elements, but retaining their basic function as alternative worship sites. Inscriptions invoke Yahweh's name while maintaining the ritual structures of Canaanite worship. Compromise solutions emerge that attempt to preserve the accessibility and immediacy of high place religion while avoiding its most problematic aspects. But the biblical narrative suggests that such compromises ultimately proved impossible. The gravitational pull of the practices embedded in these sacred sites was too strong, the theological confusion too great, the moral compromises too extensive. The high places that began as attempts to make the divine more accessible ended by making it more foreign, more morally ambiguous, more disconnected from the ethical monotheism that defined Israel's covenant relationship with Yahweh. As darkness settles over the hillside and the ancient stones fade into shadow, we are left with questions that echo across the centuries. What drives human beings to seek the sacred in high places? Why do we create physical focal points for spiritual longing? And how do we distinguish between practices that genuinely connect us with divine reality and those that merely reflect our own desires and fears? The stones cannot answer these questions, but they can witness to the persistence of human spiritual seeking, even when that seeking leads us down paths we never intended to travel. In their silent testimony, we hear the echo of choices made long ago, choices that still shape the religious landscape of our own time. Verse 4, contrasting perspective. A prophet's lament. Elijah on Mount Carmel. The wind across Mount Carmel carries with it the scent of drought and desperation. For 3 years now, the land has known no rain, and the prophet Elijah stands alone on the mountain's height, his weathered hands gripping his staff as he surveys a kingdom in spiritual and physical crisis. Below him, gathered in the valley, hundreds of his countrymen wait to witness what may be the most decisive moment in Israel's religious history. But we must step back to understand how this moment came to be, how a single man found himself standing against an entire royal court, an established priesthood, and the religious preferences of his own people. Elijah the Tishbite emerges from the wilderness like a figure from Israel's ancient past, his clothing rough camel's hair, his manner direct and uncompromising. In a time when prophecy has been domesticated, when court prophets tell kings what they wish to hear, Elijah speaks with the terrible clarity of one who has heard the voice of God in solitude and silence. His message is simple, unadorned, devastating. The drought that grips the land is not a natural disaster, but divine judgment upon a people who have abandoned their covenant with the Lord to chase after foreign gods. The rain will not return until Israel returns to exclusive worship of Yahweh. As he stands on Mount Carmel now, Elijah's mind drifts back over the journey that brought him to this confrontation. He remembers his first appearance before King Ahab, that moment when he strode into the royal court uninvited and unannounced, his voice cutting through the polite murmur of courtly conversation like a sword through silk. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, he had declared, his words falling into the startled silence like stones into still water. There shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. The king's face had flushed with anger, and something else, perhaps fear. For Ahab knew as did everyone in the court, that this wild man from the wilderness spoke with an authority that could not be dismissed or ignored. This was not the measured rhetoric of professional prophets, but the raw voice of divine judgment. And then Elijah had turned and walked away, leaving behind a court buzzing with confusion and a king who would spend the next 3 years hunting him across the wilderness. Those 3 years had been a time of testing not just for Israel, but for Elijah himself. Hidden first by the brook Cherith, and then among the Gentiles of Zarephath, he had watched from afar as his prophecy came to terrible fulfillment. The rains failed, the crops withered, the herds died. The people cried out to their gods, Baal the storm bringer, Asherah the fertility goddess, the golden calves of Dan and Bethel, but the heavens remained closed. During those years of exile, Elijah had wrestled with questions that cut to the heart of his prophetic calling. Was he truly God's messenger, or simply a madman convinced of his own importance? Had he the right to call down judgment upon an entire nation for the sins of its leaders? What gave him the authority to stand against kings and priests, against popular opinion and established tradition? The answers had come not in dramatic revelations, but in the daily experience of divine provision. Ravens bringing food to his hiding place by the brook. A widow's flour and oil multiplying to sustain him through the famine. Her dead son restored to life through his prayers. Each miracle had been both a personal blessing and a theological statement. The God of Israel was not bound by drought or death, was not limited by the failure of rain or the power of competing deities. But perhaps the deepest confirmation of his calling had come through his intimate knowledge of the people's suffering. Hidden among them, disguised as a common traveler, he had seen how the drought affected not just the wealthy merchants and royal courtiers, but the poor farmers whose children grew thin and whose elderly members died quietly in corners. He had witnessed the desperate measures people took in their search for divine intervention, the increased sacrifices at the high places, the more extreme rituals, the growing desperation that led some to practices that horrified even syncretistic Israelites. It was this suffering that had finally driven him from hiding and back to confront Ahab. Not theological principle alone, but the concrete agony of a people trapped between their unfaithful leaders and their inadequate gods. Now, standing on Mount Carmel with the assembled multitude below him, Elijah faces the culmination of his prophetic ministry. The challenge he has issued is unprecedented in its scope and audacity. Let the prophets of Baal and Asherah, all 850 of them, supported by Queen Jezebel's patronage and popular acclaim, let them prepare their sacrifice and call upon their gods to send fire from heaven. And let him alone prepare his sacrifice and call upon the Lord. Whichever deity answers with fire, let that one be acknowledged as the true God of Israel. The theological implications of the challenge are staggering. Elijah is not merely claiming that Yahweh is superior to the other gods, but that he is the only God, that the others are empty pretensions, powerless figments of human imagination. In an ancient world that generally acknowledged the reality of multiple deities, this represents a revolutionary claim. But more than theology is at stake here. The very survival of Israel as a distinct people depends upon the outcome of this contest. 3 years of drought have pushed the nation to the breaking point. If Elijah's God cannot or will not act, then the experiment in monotheistic faith that began with Abraham will end here, on this mountain, with the final capitulation to the gods of Israel's neighbors. The morning preparations proceed with ritualistic care. The prophets of Baal construct their altar with obvious skill, their movements reflecting years of temple training. Their bull is carefully selected, properly slaughtered, arranged according to ancient prescriptions. Everything is done with the precision of those who believe in the efficacy of correct procedure. As Elijah watches their preparations, his mind turns to the deeper tragedy of the moment. These are not evil men in any simple sense. They are sincere in their beliefs, dedicated to their understanding of divine service. They have given their lives to what they believe is sacred work. Their failure will not be moral, but metaphysical. They serve gods who cannot answer because they do not exist. The prophets begin their invocation as the sun climbs toward its zenith. Their voices rise in practiced harmony, calling upon Baal to manifest his power, to vindicate his servants, to demonstrate his control over the forces of nature. The chanting continues for hours, growing more desperate as the sun tracks across an empty sky and no fire appears. By midday, their composed ritual has dissolved into frenzied pleading. Some of the prophets begin the ritual cutting that accompanies extreme supplication, their blood mixing with the dust of Mount Carmel as they cry out to their silent God. Others dance themselves into ecstatic trances, their consciousness altered, with their altar still cold and lifeless. Elijah's response to their desperation reveals both his theological conviction and his human compassion. His mocking words, "Cry aloud, for he is a god." Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened, cut through the religious pretension to expose the absurdity of their situation. But beneath the mockery lies a deeper tragedy. These men have devoted their lives to serving emptiness. As evening approaches and the prophets of Baal finally collapse in exhausted defeat, Elijah begins his own preparations. But his actions deliberately contrast with everything that has preceded them. Where the Baal prophets worked with elaborate ritual precision, Elijah works with simple functionality. Where they called upon their God with increasing desperation, he will speak to his God with quiet confidence. The altar he builds uses 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, a symbolic reunification of the divided kingdom under the authority of the one true God. The trenches he digs around the altar serve a practical purpose, but they also create a theological statement. He will make the miracle so decisive that no one can attribute it to trickery or natural causes. The water he pours over the sacrificed precious water in this time of drought represents the ultimate expression of faith. He is not hedging his bets or preparing escape routes. Either God will act decisively, or the prophetic movement in Israel will die with him on this mountain. His prayer, when it comes, carries none of the desperate pleading that has characterized the day's earlier invocations. It is the prayer of a man who knows to whom he speaks. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. The fire that descends in response to this prayer comes with a completeness that staggers even Elijah. Not only does it consume the sacrifice, but it burns up the wood, the stones, the dust, even the water in the trenches. It is a theophany, a divine manifestation that removes all ambiguity about the source of the miracle. The people's response is immediate and overwhelming. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. The cry ripples through the assembled multitude like wind through wheat, a confession that represents both acknowledgement of truth and repentance from error. But even in this moment of triumph, Elijah experiences the complex emotions that mark true prophetic ministry. Yes, God has vindicated his prophet and his exclusive claims to divinity. Yes, the people have acknowledged their error and returned to covenant faithfulness. But at what cost? The prophets of Baal, sincere men, however misguided, will not survive this day. The religious system that has provided comfort and meaning to thousands will be swept away. Change, even necessary change, brings its own forms of suffering. As the first drops of rain begin to fall, the drought broken as dramatically as it was imposed, Elijah looks out over the people who are now prostrating themselves in worship and repentance. He has accomplished what he was called to do. He has demonstrated the reality of Israel's God and the emptiness of competing loyalties. But he also knows that this moment of clarity will not last, that the human heart's tendency toward idolatry will reassert itself, that future generations will face similar choices and perhaps make different decisions. The rain increases, and Elijah girds up his robes to run before Ahab's chariot back to Jezreel. As he runs through the gathering storm, his mind turns to the future. What will Israel do with this moment of divine revelation? Will they build their faith upon the foundation of what they have witnessed? Or will they gradually drift back toward the comfortable compromises that led to this crisis? He knows that his own work is far from over. Queen Jezebel will not accept the death of her prophets or the repudiation of her religious program. The institutional structures that support syncretistic worship remain largely intact. The human longing for visible, manageable gods will not disappear simply because those gods have been proven powerless. But for now, as he runs through the rain that signals God's acceptance of Israel's repentance, Elijah allows himself to experience the deep satisfaction of faithful service completed. He has stood in the gap between a faithless generation and divine judgment. He has called down heaven's fire to illuminate the darkness of spiritual confusion. He has been God's voice in a time when that voice seemed silent. The storm that surrounds him as he runs is both literal and metaphorical. The breaking of the drought and the breaking of a spiritual crisis that had threatened to destroy Israel's covenant identity. In calling down fire from heaven, he has not only vindicated monotheistic faith, but has demonstrated that the God of Israel remains active in history, available to those who call upon him in truth. As the lights of Jezreel appears through the rain ahead, Elijah knows that tomorrow will bring new challenges, new forms of opposition, new tests of faith. But tonight, the sky that was closed for 3 years has opened, and the rain that falls on Mount Carmel washes the blood of false sacrifice from the ancient stones, preparing the way for authentic worship to be restored in Israel. The contest on Mount Carmel will echo through the generations as testimony to the reality of divine power and the futility of idolatrous worship. But more than a theological victory, it stands as witness to the possibility of spiritual renewal, the hope that even in the darkest times of apostasy and compromise, God's voice can still be heard by those who have ears to hear, and his power can still transform the hearts of those who are willing to turn back to him. Conclusion. As our journey through the world of biblical idolatry draws to a close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of ancient history and timeless human experience. We have walked through the workshop of a sincere artisan, wrestling with the tension between craft and devotion. We have sat in the councils of King Jeroboam, watching political expediency transform into spiritual disaster. We have climbed the high places where ordinary people sought divine connection through stone and symbol. And we have witnessed the prophetic fire that called a nation back to authentic worship. Each perspective has revealed different facets of humanity's complex relationship with the divine. The artisan's hands that shape bronze into gods speak to our longing for the tangible, the immediate, the comprehensible. Jeroboam's golden calves remind us how easily spiritual compromise can masquerade as practical wisdom. The high places scattered across the land testify to our persistent need for sacred space and accessible worship. And Elijah's fire from heaven demonstrates that divine reality, when encountered authentically, burns away all lesser loyalties. Perhaps what strikes us most deeply as we reflect on these ancient struggles is their contemporary relevance. The human heart that fashioned golden calves in the wilderness continues to create its own objects of ultimate devotion. The political pressures that led Jeroboam to compromise his faith echo in our own times, when expedience wars with principle. The desire for accessible, immediate spiritual experience that drew people to the high places remains a driving force in religious life today. And the prophetic voice that called Israel back to authentic worship, that voice continues to sound across the centuries, challenging every generation to examine what it truly worships, to consider where it places its ultimate trust, to distinguish between genuine encounter with the divine and the mere projection of human desires. The story of biblical idolatry is ultimately a story about the human search for meaning, connection, and transcendence. It reveals both the nobility of that search and the tragic ways it can be misdirected. It shows us people of sincere faith making choices that seemed reasonable in their context, but led to spiritual disaster. It demonstrates the seductive power of religious practices that promise immediate benefits while gradually separating us from deeper spiritual reality. But it also reveals the persistent mercy of a God who calls his people back from their wandering, who breaks through their spiritual confusion with moments of blazing clarity, who remains available to those who seek him with whole hearts, even after they have sought him in broken ways. As you return now to your own daily rhythms, perhaps you'll carry with you some questions that these ancient stories have raised. What forms does idolatry take in your own life? What golden calves, whether material prosperity, professional success, ideological certainty, or even religious activity itself, compete for the devotion that belongs to God alone? Where are you drawn to high places of your own making, seeking spiritual experience on your own terms rather than God's? And perhaps most importantly, can you hear, in the quiet spaces of your own heart, the voice that called to Elijah on Mount Carmel? Not in wind or earthquake or fire, but in the sound of gentle stillness? That voice which continues to speak to those who have ears to hear, calling us back from our wandering, back to authentic worship, back to the God who alone deserves our ultimate devotion. The ancient stones on the hilltops remain silent now, their power broken, their purposes forgotten. But the God who answered Elijah's prayer with fire remains as present today as he was on Mount Carmel, as ready to transform hearts as he was in the time of the golden calves, as committed to his people's flourishing as he was when the high places dotted the landscape of the promised land. May you find in these ancient stories not just historical curiosity, but personal invitation, an invitation to examine your own heart, to consider your own loyalties, and to discover afresh the God who seeks not golden images or elaborate rituals, but simply hearts that turn toward him in truth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the world of biblical idolatry. Until we meet again in these quiet explorations of faith and history, may you find peace in the silence, wisdom in the ancient stories, and in your own spiritual seeking, may you always be drawn back to the one who is worthy of all devotion. This is the Shepherd's Candle, your tour guide through history.